Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, college football fans, college sports fans across the nation and around the world. This is Tim May with the Tim May Show. Probably the 300th edition of this. I'm not sure, but I've got a special guest on today. Try to have a special guest on every week, but this guy is an interesting dude. His name is Jim Cavale. He's the head of athletes.org. He's got quite an extensive background building up to athletes.org. He was an aspiring baseball player, if I'm not mistaken, at one point in his life, and then now he's trying to help, for want of another term, organize college athletes. And what's interesting about that is there's never probably been a more crucial time for athletes to get organized. And we'll get into that in a moment. And you know what I mean by organized? Having a voice or just a couple of voices speaking for them in this turbulent time of trying to get a hold of the transfer portal, the NIL, revenue sharing right on down the line. So, Jim Cavale, welcome to the Tim May Show.
Tim, thanks for having me on, man. This is going to be a fun conversation on what is quite the ever-evolving product of college athletics.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I wanted to throw this out there right at the beginning. I've always said, even after this, the transfer portal NIL finally came to fruition. I've always said athletes should have been college football players, especially in basketball, who are generating tremendous revenue, should have been sharing in that. I've been saying that for 40 years. But then past that, now with the NIL, with the money out there, and now revenue sharing, which is going to come if they ever get the House settlement settled, with revenue sharing coming. But then the transfer portal, which gave athletes unprecedented rights to just get up and leave. But they should have had these rights a long time ago, some of these. But, it's really funny. I've never thought that college athletics should be looked at as a career. It should be looked at as kind of what the founding fathers had in mind. We'll get Nate Bargatze to do a little skit on this. But what the founding fathers had in mind was work for cheap, play football and move on to the NFL. Well, that, work for a scholarship, whatever. But you and I both know that long ago, the value worth of a scholarship didn't quite cover what it takes to be a college athlete, especially on the big time level and stuff. And so I wanted to premise with that because the other thing is, you get in the National Football League, the average lifespan is 3.7 years or career span. You spend more time in that in college now, and
Yeah,
you should be sharing in the growth and the revenue, et cetera, which they sort of are. But I just wanted to get your take on
yeah.
what niche did you see there that made you really go into this whole hog, the athletes.org thing of basically organizing athletes.
Yeah, well, like you said, I played college baseball. I'm from New York, came down to Alabama to play college baseball and never left. I still live in Birmingham to this day. And, I've been a founder and entrepreneur in the sports and fitness space for 20 years since I graduated in 2005. And, I've built multiple companies in the space and had some exits and some success. Definitely had a lot of failures as well. And that's where I've done all my learning.
Yeah.
But about 10 years ago, I started a company called Influencer. And the reason I started the company is because I felt strongly, due to the O'Bannon ruling, that NIL was not a matter of if, but when. But 10 years ago, NIL wasn't even, in a glimpse of most of the minds of college athletics leaders. So I started a company to help athletes on social media and built software that schools bought and pro teams to provide to their athletes to help them build their brands responsibly on social. And that's what Influencer became. And by 2019, we had 3,000 pro and college teams as clients and 100,000 athletes using the platform on a daily basis. And that's around the time that NIL in 2019 became a reality because of the Fair Pay to Play Act in California.
Yep.
And so Teamworks, a bigger software company in the college and pro sports space, came to me and said, listen, we want to buy your company, but we want you to stay on board as CEO because we believe NIL is going to happen in the next few years and we need to build for it. So I did the deal, and at Teamworks, we built payments and reporting software that we rolled out in 2021 when NIL began, and 220 of our Division One customers bought it. And so by 2022, we had hundreds of millions of dollars of NIL data from a couple hundred schools, and what we could see was pretty clear. 90% of the money was coming from donors. They were laundering money through a shell company called a collective to pay players to play at the school. And I would start to show college athletics administrators, ADs and commissioners, this data and I'd say, listen, this is what NIL's become. It's become pay to play through NIL, and it's not really NIL endorsements. It's compensation to play quarterback. And I'd explain to them like the reason we're here in this unstructured environment where NIL is being used for pay for play is because O'Bannon beat you in court and you didn't create a system to get in front of it.
Right.
And around that time in 22, NIL was a year old. All this is happening. There were new court cases. There was Hubbard, Carter, Johnson, House versus the NCAA. And I would explain to ADs and commissioners like these cases are about you paying your players directly, the way the rest of the multi-billion-dollar sports and entertainment businesses in America operate. They pay their talent. And I get a lot of pushback when I would talk about those cases and creating a system to get in front of it. And so by 2023, I felt like I had done my job, not only building Influencer, but selling it to Teamworks, getting it to be the company it became for NIL for all these schools. And that's where I decided to step down as CEO and start athletes.org, because there is no way to set rules in college athletics without collective bargaining. There's no way you can have rules that can be enforced without litigation unless you have the National Labor Relations Act protecting you with an antitrust protection that allows you to do all that, to set rules, to enforce them, and to uphold them. And so to do a collective bargaining agreement, you need two vehicles. You need a vehicle that represents the athletes, a vehicle that looks a lot like the NFLPA looks in football and pros. And then you need a vehicle that represents the schools, a vehicle that is a league vehicle, a league entity like the NFL is for all the 32 teams that are a part of it. And those two vehicles negotiate transfer rules, free agency rules, compensation rules, health and safety standards, academic requirements, eligibility limits, all the things that a lot of people on both sides, the athlete side and the school side, want to have in college athletics. Yeah. And so that's what we set out to build. And we can talk more about what athletes.org is. But when you look at the history of college athletics, you got to realize that in the middle of the 20th century, Walter Byers was the president of the NCAA for 37 years, from 51 to 87. And during those 37 years, he created the idea of amateurism through the term student-athlete. And you'll notice I never call them student athletes. I call them college athletes because that term really has a pretty bad history. It was created because a player, Ray Dennison, died playing college football, and the NCAA didn't want its schools being liable for workers' compensation to that family when that death occurred. Yeah. And so student-athlete protects the schools from having to pay certain types of things that the rest of the businesses in America are having to pay: payroll taxes, workers' comp, overtime, minimum wage. And so what's ironic is in 1985, 2 years before Byers stepped down as president of the NCAA, he did a Sports Illustrated interview where he condemned everything he had built and said, we've commercialized college football and college basketball. We probably should recreate the athlete compensation model beyond a scholarship. He got a lot of flack for it. He retired in 87. And in 94, he wrote a book called Unsportsmanlike Conduct, which is 500 pages condemning everything he did. It's very, very good. And so like there's been many times throughout history, starting with Byers, again with O'Bannon, and so on, where they've had a chance to get it right. And we're in another one of those phases right now because the House settlement solves 3% of the problems and creates another flurry of issues that will come next. And the only solution is collective bargaining.
Yeah. By the way, it's funny because as you were talking about that, I was just thinking, like 10, 15, 20 years from now, maybe sooner than that, student athlete might be considered a slur,
Yeah,
that was
right.
a convenient way of basically keeping people down, for want of another term. I'm not going to get into the other words you could compare that with. But the bottom line is, yeah, we are where we are here today. And one of the reasons we are where we are here today is because the NCAA, which is, by the way, I always remind people of this, it is the member schools. It is Ohio State, it is Alabama, it is USC, it is Grambling, it is, name a school. That is the NCAA. They vote on things and reluctantly, like an iceberg, move to make changes, etc. At least they have in the past. Now all of a sudden they've had a kick in the butt, in essence, from the legal community to get things going, and that's why I'm interested in this. I've said this 3-4 years ago when people were first asking me, how are you going to ever get a handle on this perfect storm of transfer portal, NIL, for example, opportunities? And number one, the schools had to get involved with paying paying the players. But you know what that means? Excuse me, the college athletes. I'll use your term. And on top of that, to have a hold on them, you have to have something akin to a contract. And nobody wants to touch that word right now, or at least they haven't, because you have to legally have a hold on, which means you owe something to them, and they owe something to you, from an allegiance
Yeah.
standpoint. And what I'm
Yeah.
asking you is, before you can like have a, I mean, you can always get guys together and then have a strike or something, and we've seen attempts at that before, but can you get to where it needs to go without athletes being under some form of quote contract?
No, you have to have a contract. And the biggest hole in house, the settlement,
Yeah.
is that the contracts that are going to be revenue sharing deals between the schools and the athletes under this $20.5 million cap that wasn't collectively bargained, which is
Yep.
also going to be sued against. But the biggest hole is the schools will now have all of these NIL publicity rights contracts with the athletes being paid. And the reason that's an issue is because that's not what the coach is selling to the athlete when he's recruiting him. He's selling, come here, play quarterback, we'll pay you $1 million.
Yeah.
On the contract, it says, come here and you represent the school in these ways, and your likeness can be used in these ways on the scoreboard, and you have to do these appearances, and you can't do promotional endorsement deals with brands in these categories because they conflict with the sponsors of the school. And there are these marketing deals that the school is going to be doing with the athlete. So now the player doesn't play well, and the coach wants the player to go into the portal.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't a performance contract to play quarterback. So how can you really hold the player accountable and push him out? On the other side, a player plays really well, better than the contract would have thought. Well, now why can't they leave? Even if they're under contract, it's just a publicity rights deal. And so they're going to try to use words and phrases and clauses in these contracts that still lock athletes into pay to play type activities, but ultimately they're not performance deals. And so for the lay fan out there, Patrick Mahomes has two categories of revenue as an athlete playing quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs. He has his performance deal with the Chiefs, his salary that he gets paid to play quarterback. It's base salary, incentives for making all NFL, making it to the Super Bowl, etc. Then separately, he has NIL deals that are real NIL deals with State Farm and other brands paying him to do publicity things for their brand. Well, we're taking the State Farm type deals and we're making them look like the quarterback deal.
Correct.
And that's not going to work. It's going to be a big issue. And there's going to be a lot of lawsuits coming for her. And you know what? They're not coming to the NCAA anymore. They're going directly to the school, to the coach. That's what House has done for the NCAA, is it's taken the liability off of the NCAA, off of the conferences, and it's shifting it in this new era to the schools, who will be sued directly over these contracts and over many other things that we've seen: eligibility, academic requirements, Title IX, how they choose to split up the money, all coming directly to the school.
Hey, I don't mean to jump to the end of the book before we've read the middle of it, but what is the solution, Jim?
Yeah, the solution is the schools that play big time college football and college basketball need to become part of one league, one entity. It could be a conglomerate of the conferences we saw in the early 2010s. The power conferences become the autonomy conferences, which allowed them to kind of set their own rules and do some of their own governance without the NCAA involved. The NCAA is too wide of a sample. It's 500,000 student athletes. It's 1,100 different schools, 40 different sports. We're talking about $18 billion a year coming in to college athletics. And the great majority of that comes from college football, with a little bit coming from college basketball. And so the players who play at the big time autonomy conference schools in those sports need to be a part of a vehicle that they can negotiate from. And that's what we've built at athletes.org. And we have 4,700 members at this point. There's about 10,000 of those athletes that play those sports at those schools. So we're working up to signing those athletes to become members. It's free. We offer them a bunch of benefits: legal, accounting, mental health, background checks on agents. We poll them and survey them to get their voice out there. That's what we've built at athletes.org. So there needs to be a vehicle for the athletes that play at those schools in those sports, but there also needs to be a league entity that those schools are a member of. And that league entity and that organization representing the athletes negotiate all of the rules that we need.
Yeah.
And if Congress doesn't help out, they have to be employees to do that collective bargaining.
Right.
Because That's the only way it works with the current law. The National Labor Relations Act will protect those rules that are collectively bargained should the athletes who play those sports at those schools be employees and a part of a union, and the schools can be a part of this league vehicle, and they can negotiate these rules, and they'll be protected by the NLRA, and the lawsuits, at least from those athletes around those rules that they've agreed to, will not be possible anymore, and you'll be able to enforce those rules. That's where we will end up. And we already know that there's going to be a money issue for every school, including Ohio State, who makes the most gross revenue, because Ohio State outspends their gross revenue by $20-30 million a year. They lose money, right? So coming up with 20 million with the House settlement per school is going to be hard. Not going to be as hard for Ohio State as it's going to be for Iowa State, but it's going to be hard for everyone. And to get more money, this league entity that these autonomy conference schools playing big time basketball and football could command together as one entity from the media is much larger than the Big Ten media deal, the SEC media deal, the Big 12 media deal, and the ACC media deal added up together right now. And the reason is because the media would love to be in a deal with all of those schools together to be over the scheduling, the way the championships work, all the stuff that would add more value and create new property for those schools to generate more money to be able to afford all this.
Yeah, it's been amazing, the competition off the field, like you said, among the leagues. I mean, Ohio State's part of the Big Ten, which has, for example, in football, deals with NBC, CBS, and Fox, and the Big Ten Network, which is part of Fox, and how the SEC has partnered for one of another term with ESPN, ABC, and all this kind of stuff. And it's just interesting because no one wants to give up their power, because they, like the Big Ten has shown, this is the way you generate more money than the SEC. It's a competition in that regard too, right? Do you see an eventual, what will make this coalesce? What will be the eventual meeting of the minds, or the spark for the lightning bolt that causes the Big Ten and the SEC to truly get together? We believe there are talks going on right now in that regard. What do you think? It almost has to be a legal happening, like the House settlement, but then past that, right? I mean, there has to be something that causes them to join together and agree to, in essence, do things in a joint way as opposed to helter skelter.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the situation has two categories of catalytic happenings that will make the future happen when it happens, right? So the first category is legal, and the second category is economic.
Yeah.
And so on the economic side, we'll start with the latter. In the early 2030s, these media deals start to come up, these conference media deals. Yeah. And at that point, the opportunity to consolidate into one media deal will be as real as it's ever been. And schools will be 5 to 7 years into the House settlement, where they're going to have an economic burden that they didn't have before that's going to be heavy for all of them to carry.
Yeah.
And so the economic side, I think, triggers in 2030 to 2032. And what you have to realize about the SEC and the Big Ten, and everybody knows this, especially Ohio State fans, but in their own league, they have implosions developing. Like Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan, USC, Washington, Oregon know that they bring much more value than Rutgers, Northwestern, Minnesota, Michigan State, et cetera, Maryland, right? Yeah. And that also exists in the SEC with the Mississippi States and Vanderbilts not bringing the same value that Alabama and LSU and Georgia and Tennessee, et cetera, Texas bring. So there's no upside for the top teams in these leagues. We just saw
right.
Ohio State just shared an even share of the Big Ten media deal with all the other 17 Big Ten schools. Then they made it all the way to the CFP final, which they got $20 million for, and they split it 17 ways with the other 17 Big Ten schools. While Notre Dame, who's independent, kept all 20 million when they made it to the championship game. Yeah. So there's going to need to be an upside. The average fan would see through a Big Ten SEC Super League because more than half the teams in those leagues are not football powers. And I know the economics would be so great that, Minnesota or Rutgers would become great at football and all this stuff, but it's just not the reality of the situation. If you talk to anybody who negotiates media deals for these conferences, they'll tell you there's like 12 teams that the media networks care about. And they don't care who they're playing. They can play the other 18, 24, whatever teams, and it'll still be a game they want to carry.
An
But they
attraction.
want to carry as many games as they can with those 12 teams.
Yeah.
And so, and there's, and I know this is a sensitive topic, and I know I'm in Birmingham, but I'm from New York. I'm objective, I
Hey,
swear.
I
But
was
the
born in
SEC,
Alabama. Go ahead.
there you go. But the SEC probably has more of those 12 teams than the Big Ten. That doesn't mean the Big Ten don't have a good. I mean, they got Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, but like the SEC probably has more. But either way, both leagues have weak teams that aren't going to bring that value to a media deal. So I don't know that an SEC Big Ten alliance is going to work for two reasons. It's got a lot of bottom half teams that people don't care about. And secondly, unless there's upside for the teams that bring the most value, I don't know that they're going to want to do that deal. I think the next deal that happens, Ohio State and Alabama are going to make sure they get upside for bringing more of the value than everyone else.
Yeah.
And so that's the economic side of this. The legal side of this is post house. There is going to be a flurry of lawsuits. And there's also going to be a flurry of new actions by athletes that frustrate fans and schools. There's going to be a lot of holdouts. Will there be a boycott? Who knows? But holdouts like Nico did, yes, there's going to be a lot more of that. And Nico's holdout, while it didn't work great for him, is an example of something you can do in college football that you can't do in the NFL. If Nico was an NFL quarterback and he wanted to hold out, he'd be fined for holding out, number one. Number two, he'd have to work the holdout out with Tennessee. He couldn't just shop around with everyone else. You can't do that in the NFL if you're under contract. And so I think you're going to have a lot of legal pain that might shrink the timeline from 2030 or 2032 to 28 or 29. And somewhere in there, 28 to 33, that 5 year, half decade, I think is when everything goes down. I think it's when you have a football super league. I think it's when you have potentially a basketball super league. I think it's when you have a commissioner of each of those leagues that's in charge. I think it's when you have those athletes become employees, be allowed to collectively bargain, and you can set rules that can be enforced without lawsuit.
Yeah. I always said, man, after the 2021 season, if CJ Stroud and Bryce Young had just said, instead of being so faithful to their own teams, hey, here we are.
Yeah.
Where's the
Yeah.
jack? And made themselves free agents, put themselves on the, like Nico, basically Nico Iamaleava. Can't
I
ever
am
say his name.
Alieva. I am
Yeah.
Alieva. Or some people now call him I am a leaving.
I am a leaving. Yeah, on a jet plane. That would have shaken everybody up from the beginning. That something's got to be done here and stuff. But hey, last thing, do you like we were talking about? It's almost like relegation. If like you're not keeping up. But I always say this about college football that's different than the NFL. You got to have people to beat. I mean, to keep the fans at Texas A&M or Ohio State or Alabama or USC even happy, you got to have somebody to beat. I
You
mean,
do. Yeah.
that's the difference between this and the NFL. In a lot.
Yeah. I
That's
mean,
not the only difference. But go
look
ahead.
at the spreads. Look at the spreads in the NFL. If you
Yeah,
just look at a normal weekend, we know that the facts show gambling drives viewership. Okay.
yeah,
Gambling and fantasy. There is no fantasy in college, and that's because the sample's too wide across too many teams. And there are very few single digit spreads each weekend in college football. Whereas in the NFL, almost every spread out of all 15 games is single digit. And so that's the difference. Look no further. And I think that they're, in addition to having more value to putting the best teams in one league and getting one media deal, I think there's also more value to a second and third tier league of FBS teams being able to play for their own championship.
that's
Listen,
coming.
I'm from Syracuse.
Yeah.
I grew up in the 90s there. We were really good at football. We had 3 or 4 top 10 finishes.
Oh,
We haven't been what we were. Now, Fran's trying to bring it back, and I'm rooting hard for it as a Syracuse guy. I didn't go there, but I grew up there. And I know Syracuse would love to be in the tier 1 league. But even if they ended up in the tier 2 league, and you have the Syracuses and the other schools you could imagine in that tier 2 league playing for a championship, and when you win it, you get brought up to the tier 1 league.
yeah.
And there's accountability to the tier 1 league for those bottom teams that could get relegated down. I think that's a whole unrealized property of viewership that is going to generate a lot new revenue. I think you could even go a step further with the group of 5 schools. And, Tim Pernetti has talked a little bit about this, but like there was a Reddit post at the end of the year last year that basically said, okay, here's the teams that made the CFP. Let's take the next, 16 teams and create an NIT for college football,
Yeah.
right? And they
Yeah.
created a bracket, and you had like Alabama, Syracuse, all these schools in there that didn't make the CFP that a lot of people would have loved to watch in a tournament, probably even more than they would have loved to watch in a bowl game,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so that all that stuff, they're going to have to think about those things and do them because they're not going to have the money to even do what House is going to require them to do. And these types of ideas are going to be what the innovators who set the stage for the future step up and do. And the ones who didn't speak up will be the ones whose legacy will be more associated with how we got here.
Yeah, I was talking with the Bowling Green athletic director several weeks ago, and he's already said, there's been conversation among his peers. Uh, I'm talking about of that Mid American Conference ilk, like we're talking about of consolidation from the standpoint of like making things a little more regional for each, so you don't have to travel as far. I mean, just all kinds of things because they don't have near the resources. The in the NCAA's eyes, Ohio State and Ohio University are the same thing, right? I
Yeah,
mean, but they're not. And
they're not.
everybody knows it. And that doesn't mean one can't beat the other in football or basketball, but that's not the point. How much money are you going to take out of the student activity fund to pay for football and basketball at that level of schools? And especially when revenue sharing comes, I'm not even sure how that's going to work for that level of schools. But that's what he was talking about. There's already a movement underway as this thing gets settled out, for want of another term, the settlement gets settled out among the big boys, the Power Four, plus Notre Dame. Hey, last thing, I just said that, but that's my calling card. One more question for you. If you could give student athletes right now, if they had bargaining power, and you can name 50 things, but if you could give them one thing they don't have the right to right now, in terms of it being guaranteed, uh, is it the medical side of things? Where would you go first if you? What would be your first item on the agenda other than obviously getting paid?
I think it would start with standardized contracts. I think that college athletes should be able to negotiate the standard contract template across all schools. It allows schools to not have to manipulate contracts to get eventually one up on each other, but it also allows college athletes to have clauses around all these things in those contracts, including maybe some health and safety things that would create fairness. That'd probably be the number one thing. It's hard to pick one, but that
Yeah,
one at least can hit a lot of other things. But even though you didn't ask, just to name a few other things, you're hearing college football coaches through the AFCA, the American Football Coach Association, come out and say, we want one transfer portal,
yeah,
10-day window, and we want it to be the beginning of the year. I'm going to tell you right now, college athletes would not go for that. That's too short of a window.
yep,
There's a lot of issues with transferring at that time of year, especially for athletes that might go to a school on a quarter system, transferring to a school on a semester system. The point is like, if they're going to try to regulate the portal, college athletes should be able to speak into that too. But I'm not going to mention that as my top one because you know what? There really is no portal.
yeah,
Athletes can unenroll and enroll anytime they want. Xavier
yeah,
Lucas, the wide receiver at Wisconsin, proved that when he left outside of the portal window and then went to Miami, and the NCAA said, well, technically, he can unenroll and enroll anytime he wants. So really, the portal and every other rule you hear, fans, is a myth. And the
yeah,
reason it's a myth is because none of the rules can be upheld. And the reason none of the rules can be upheld is because they're operating in an antitrust violation that is unprecedented in America in a multi-billion dollar sports and entertainment business. And so the DOJ came out and said, you can't have non-competes on non-employees. Well, that's why we have a transfer portal. Not because the athletes got it, asked for it. It just happened
yeah.
because it's just against the law.
Hey, real quick before you go, I always said the NCAA, and that's a collective, as I referred to it earlier, they kicked the can so far down the road that for at least a little while now, they figured out a way for other people to pay their players. You know what I mean? I mean, you got to think in some ways that's diabolical genius, but it's
Yeah.
really just disregard, and
I like to picture it like you walk into a Chick-fil-A, okay? You
yeah,
walk into the restaurant and the owner's in there and he welcomes you in and you go and order your food and you pay for your food. and you get your food, and then the owner says, "Hey, I got this bucket over here, and it's to pay my staff. Could you put some money here in my bucket so I can pay my staff because they do a good job keeping this clean and serving you?" And I would say, "Well, I thought I just paid your staff by paying for the food." "Oh, no, 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 that doesn't go to my staff." Well, what's the analogy? Well, in college football, fans pay for tickets, they pay for parking, they pay for food, they pay for all these things, but none of that money is going to go to the talent that they showed up to be able to see.
Yeah.
Instead, they got to go into a bucket and give money to pay the talent.
Yeah.
And that doesn't even make sense. Once again, just equate this to any other business in America. It doesn't make sense. And it also is violating the law.
Yeah. And not only that, but a lot of people have it in their mind it's a bottomless bucket, and that's not accurate at all. I mean,
No.
you're trying to get people to help you build a building over here and help you pay the athletes over here. And it's just the taffy is always the fans, And we all know this. What has driven college athletics from the beginning, any kind of school athletics, is bragging rights, pride and bragging rights, and you want to be as Ohio State, you want to brag that you have more NIL opportunities than Alabama does.
Sure.
You don't want it to necessarily be an equal, even playing field, but it's more. This is more about protecting the players down the road because right now it is a free for all to a certain extent,
Yeah.
and
Well, we went from donors
yeah,
giving to the school and writing it off and probably giving some players some cash down below the table.
yeah, yeah,
That's why my podcast is called Now It's Legal, is because
yeah.
that's what NIL really
I love
stands
it.
for. Donors have been doing this for years.
Yeah,
But we went from that where they donate to the school for a building and they get to write it off because it's a donation. Then during NIL, we've gone to, well, you got to give to a collective, but you can't get a write off because they're not a 501c3. We saw the collectives that are 501c3s get in trouble with the IRS.
yep.
And so they've been giving, but without a write off. And now they're going to go back to, hey, now you can give to the school because we can pay the athletes directly so you can write it off again.
Okay. Hey, now it's legal. Now it's legal is the podcast for Jim Cavale. Jim Cavale, head of athletes.org. Man, the frontier, it's amazing. Just when it's kind of like it's to me, it's like the pioneers back in the old days. Just when they crossed the Rockies, then there was another mountain range they had to go over. You know what I'm saying? I mean, the
Yeah.
mountains just went endlessly into. I think that's what we're looking at right now, aren't we?
Yeah, it is. And, this is, it's going to be a process. And unfortunately, the people who pay for all this are the fans and they're going to be dragged through it. And the people who put their lives on the line are the athletes and they're going to be dragged through it. And that's the unfortunate part of this. But when you have leaders who have, an average contract term of 3 to 5 years and don't really have ownership in the, institution that they're representing, they're going to think in 3 to 5 year lengths.
Yeah.
And so that's why we're here. But it's gonna be beautiful when it finally all happens.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's Jim Cavale of athletes.org and the Now It's Legal podcast. Thank you very much once again for joining the Tim May Show.
Thank you for having me.